Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I am talking today with Frederick Clarkson, Senior Research Analyst at Political Research Associates. So thank you for dropping into Mindshift Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
So do you go by Frederick or Fred? I need to ask you that right up front.
Well, I use Frederick for sort of public commercial purposes, but my friends and colleagues call me Fred. So
okay, so Fred. Is that all right to call you Fred then?
Please do.
I know we've actually only met now in person, but we've been emailing back and forth for probably 2 years maybe about doing a podcast episode, because I came across your name when I started researching basically Dominion theology, the Christian right, Christian Reconstructionism, R.J. Rushdoony. Your name popped up straight away because obviously you've written a lot of articles, you've written books on this subject. So I'm really glad that we finally are able to connect.
Yeah, it's always very strange to doing Google searches to find my name popping up in the same sentence as R.J. Rushdoony all the time. Even our pictures are connected. So
right. You do have a beard kind of like he did. I have to say that. You have an epic beard going.
Yours is closer to his than mine.
Yeah, I've got a bit more down there. I don't shave anymore. I just let it go. So what got you into, I know you've been writing and researching on this for a long time. What got you into studying this sort of area of information?
Well, I've always been interested in religion and politics, but I arrived in Washington, D.C. I was a recent college graduate during the Carter administration. And by the time Ronald Reagan showed up as president, Washington, D.C. had transformed, and you couldn't be awake and interested in politics and religion without seeing what had happened. You know, I was a 3 newspaper a day kind of guy, but, you know, newspapers were dying. And Washington, D.C. had become a 1 newspaper town until the Washington Times showed up. And so the number 2 daily in the nation's capital started out, you know, with a 4-color, you know, front page that nobody had. And it was all subsidized by the Unification Church of Sun Myung Moon.
Yes, and I remember that.
And that's still the case.
It was a front for the Moonies, basically, wasn't it?
Front for the Moonies and various international intelligence agencies. So that got me researching and writing about this stuff. But you know, more broadly, the Christian right had come to town with Ronald Reagan, and he was populating his administration with the people who he owed. And, you know, the growth of the Christian right, you know, is well known. But like I say, from my standpoint, you couldn't be interested in these things and not see it and not want to know more.
Mm-hmm. So you're going back 1976, the year of the evangelical, right? So right. As you say, Carter gets elected off the back of a surprising surge in evangelical voters. It was kind of like they didn't even realize how big of a base they could potentially be.
Yes, they did.
And then, yeah, that was the whole thing. Everything started changing around that time, wasn't it? When they were like, hey, this could be something huge.
Well, yeah, it's the right wing had been interested in for a long time in figuring out how they could mobilize conservative evangelicals who, because of their theology, were generally apolitical, right?
Right.
Marginally political. So even though Jimmy Carter was a relatively liberal Democrat, certainly by their standards, the conservative movement backed Jimmy Carter over very quietly, you know, over Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford had gotten in, you know, as in the middle of Richard Nixon's second term. As an incumbent president, he had a good chance of being reelected. And if he was reelected to 1 term, there's a good chance he would be reelected to a 2nd term, because within the Constitution, you can be a president for 10 years. So therefore, the right, who didn't like the moderate Jerry Ford, you know, would rather have 1 term of Jimmy Carter, who they thought they could replace with Ronald Reagan, than 2 terms of Gerald Ford, who would marginalize them. But here's the interesting thing in their strategy. They realized correctly, as it turned out, that you could begin to mobilize evangelicals if the candidate was one of them. Right?
That's
so it's like John Kennedy was the first Catholic, president, and he mobilized a lot of Catholics because of that identity connection. That's part of how the Christian right created the Christian right by electing a liberal Democrat as president.
Because they soured on Carter, didn't they? At first they were, oh, he's a Christian. He's clearly an evangelical. Some people have said he's truly probably the only president we've ever had in America that was a true evangelical. Everybody else just pandered to the Christian right. But Carter was a genuine Christian, I think, wasn't he?
People like Jimmy Carter, and they respect, his commitment to his principles and the life that he lives. But, Bill Clinton was an evangelical Christian.
Yeah.
Al Gore's an evangelical Christian,
And they were Democrats. Come on now.
But this is what I mean. Yeah. It's like there's a false narrative about who evangelicals and Democrats even are.
Right. What does it mean? Yeah. So they soured on Carter, though, wasn't it? Because his policies were obviously much more liberal. They didn't see him as pandering to the Christian right. It seemed like then they turned against him and found this evangelical friendly candidate, Ronald Reagan, as you said. And his famous statement in 1980, wasn't it? You can't endorse me, but I endorse you. And the whole place just went wild. It was an event in Dallas, I think it was.
Yeah, the occasion was the Republican National Convention that nominated him as president. But they were sort of a rump event held by, testing my memory here. I think the Religious Roundtable.
I was going to say Religious Roundtable.
Yeah, which was sort of one of the big Christian right coalitions of the time. And so there were suddenly several thousand people, many of them pastors, who were at this rump event that Ronald Reagan addressed, and he said these things. And and that was a remarkable thing. The Christian Reconstructionist writer Gary North remarked on it at the time that this was amazing, paraphrasing his idea here. But this was amazing because these were the people that used to be apolitical. And here they are at this big political event, and they've absorbed the ideas of Rushdoony and Reconstructionism more than they even know.
Yeah, there's that famous story, isn't there? I think it's in Michael McVicker's book on R.J. Rushdoony.
That's right.
Someone turns to Gary North and says, basically, how come Rushdoony isn't here speaking? He should be at this event. We all read his books, but nobody wants to admit that, So there's this kind of apocryphal story out there about how much of an impact Rushdoony actually had. Even though you don't see his name really, he's not up there with the Paul Wyricks and the Jerry Falwells and the Tim LaHaye's when it comes to sort of the main players, is it, in the Christian right?
Yeah, because he wasn't really a player on the Christian right. He was sort of behind the scenes influence. He saw himself as building the theological foundation for the Christian world to come. He saw the imminent collapse of the United States and the economy, perhaps in a nuclear war. In fact, he built his Chalcedon Foundation as basically an underground bunker that he thought would survive nuclear war with Russia. And so, so he was a survivalist in that way, right? But the thinking, his life's work was to build this theological foundation for what should emerge from the ashes. He's a scholar and a thinker and a writer and a pastor. Not really a pastor, more he was a member of the clergy, but he couldn't find any kind of church that would have him or that he would have.
It went both ways, surely.
It does. He seemed to be kind of a pain in the ass personally.
Sounds like it.
But somebody
be very volatile.
But who had his own ideas, and he was sticking to them. So that's why, but he also knew, and this is part of why he stayed in the shadows, he knew that his ideas were far too controversial, far too revolutionary, far too threatening to most of what he considered to be the established order, including much of, organized conservatism and libertarianism. He and North, infused Reconstructionist ideas to what places they could in a rather subversive and quiet way.
So what would you say were the bedrock kind of core ideas? Because it seems like to me, reading through Institutes of Biblical Laws and some of his earlier books, I don't know if he was the first sort of Christian Protestant theologian to articulate dominion theology. Would you see anybody before him? I mean, obviously he borrowed from Calvin and Kuyper and other people, but they weren't dominionist in the strict sense of the word. Was there anybody else before Rushdoony that you have come across that sort of articulated that dominionist idea?
No, no, he was the first. His
Right.
original contribution, if we could call it that, was that if you imagine that you should have a Christian world governed according to the revealed principles in the Bible, well, what exactly would that look like?
Mm-hmm.
And he was the first person who systematized that idea by mining everything he could find, particularly in the Old Testament. It's like, well, okay, you have the Ten Commandments and various judicial applications of the Ten Commandments. And he went and dug them all out and systematized it. And that's what became the Institutes of Biblical Law in both volumes. If you were going to follow a biblical worldview, that's what it would be. So even though there are people who disagree with him on various interpretations or, well, we'd apply this law, but not that law, he set the standard by which everyone else had to measure themselves.
I can't remember the exact quote, but you've talked about the kind of core essence of Christian dominion theology. Isn't it that idea that Christians should be running the show? Christians should be in charge. There's a lot of streams and iterations of dominion theology, isn't there? It's not a one size fits all movement, but would you say, is that the core essence? And did they borrow that idea from Rushdoony, that Christians should be in charge ultimately?
Well, I think that idea probably wasn't unique to Rushdoony. What I'm saying is that Rushdoony had, if you were really serious about that, right, if you're really going to do the whole deal, you'd have to know exactly what the Bible says and be able to pull out some reasonable applications of those ideas to contemporary society. And that's what his life's work was about, and the other Christian Reconstructionist theologians. But the idea of dominion was something that's applied in this way, I think, was a term he coined for that purpose, going back into the 1950s, according to McVicker.
Well, what would you say was Rushdoony's worldview in terms of how that was going to actually take place? What would be that vision if it would, like you say, if you were serious about it and you wanted to ascribe to his Christian Reconstructionist ideas, how did that actually flesh out? What was his vision?
His vision was not as political as many people would probably have, as far as I can tell. He wanted to, well, let me back up on that a little bit. I mean, a lot of when we talk about the theocratic or dominionist ideas that flow out of Rushdoony and like-minded people, we sort of think of, sneaky political operatives, trying to create a theocratic revolution in the here and now. That wasn't his view at all. He and the other Reconstructionist thinkers believed that you had to take these ideas, but the God's laws, as revealed in the Bible and through Rushdoony's interpretations, need to manifest in the hearts of men, and who would then express these ideas and make them real in society. That's an idea that's not unique to Rushdoony, but as far as his approach, that's what he thought. And it's not that he was an entirely apolitical guy, but he was also, from his view, extremely realistic about what you could do, even with this theocratic post-millennial vision.
It seems to me in what I've read about him and from his writings that he had this very long-term vision. It would be generations and generations, which explains perhaps why he was so involved in the Christian homeschooling movement back in the, 70s and through the 80s, maybe into the early 90s, whereby his vision was, look, it's going to be one household at a time, even. In his homeschool context, you raise these children according to this biblical worldview, godly parents and all the rest of it. Eventually, there's going to be enough of us where we will take over, and it may be 1,000 years or more. I don't know, but it was a long-term strategy.
That's right. He was thinking thousands or even tens of thousands of years. That's right. Yeah. He didn't know, but that was his estimate. Now, on the homeschooling front, that was very important because, first of all, he thought that the most important institution was the family. He differed with his colleague and son-in-law, Gary North, who thought that the church was the most important institution. And, so that their emphases were different in that way. But that's why he was involved in the homeschooling movement, because he said he and others of like mind think that the first thing you have to do is to get your children out of government schools. And find a way to educate them properly in the Christian sense as they would see it.
Yes, the government schools. It's funny because for him, this idea of statism, that it's almost like the public school or government school it's almost like a temple, isn't it? Teaching this worldview, this of secular humanism. in this government school. It's interesting because I don't know if you caught this the other day, but when Ted Cruz gave his CPAC speech just a month or two ago, he used the word statists twice in the speech. And I thought, that has to be a connection to Rushdoony's theology, because Raphael Cruz, Ted Cruz's father, is a known dominionist, isn't he? And there must be a connection to what Rushdoony was talking about. Surely Ted Cruz couldn't have used those words just off the top of his head. He had to have been referencing Rushdoony, as I saw it. I don't know what you thought about it.
He's certainly of that world, and would and when he uses words like that, like other very educated people who are grounded, in this world, they pick their words because they have particular meanings, and certainly meaningful in a Reconstructionist sense. But given it's a CPAC conference, it's also meaningful even in a secular libertarian sense. So that would be a word that he could speak to multiple audiences with.
Exactly, because another key word that he used was collectivists. He said the statists, the collectivists, ... And what struck me was in Rushdoony's understanding of statism, which is that the state has essentially become a religion. Education is a religious activity. The state is promoting the religion of secular humanism. Collectivism is almost this idea that we've lost our individual will and freedoms as individual people. Would you see Ted Cruz sort of using it in that way, would you think?
Oh, absolutely. And of course, as Rushdoony and others would understand it, it would be the goal of the secular totalitarian state to snuff out Christianity. They would often frame it in terms of, or all other religious beliefs, but they really didn't care about all other religious beliefs. That's a philosophical and constitutional convenience, right? But other than that, they wouldn't really care about what Buddhists or Jews think.
At what point, though, would you say the evangelical or Christian right, I wouldn't say they abandoned Rushdoony's ideas, but as you say, they found some of them too extreme, didn't they? I mean, the death penalty for homosexuals and incorrigible teens and women who lost their virginity before marriage. But that's what the Old Testament teaches. That's what the law teaches. He was just a literalist, it seems like. What did they retain from Rushdoony, and what did they jettison going forward in terms of the Christian right on into the 80s, 90s, and even today?
Well, I think another Christian Reconstructionist put it well. Gary DeMar heads this Reconstructionist think tank called American Vision. And way back when all this stuff was sort of first percolating in the culture, and there was a debate about these things, and one of the first issues that people got excited about was the execution of homosexuals. And Gary DeMar would say to reporters saying, we're not emphasizing that right now.
Okay.
There's a strategic vision for a lot of these folks, just because you can embrace the whole idea, but there's a certain pace and a certain set of priorities, in advancing the ball down the field.
Right.
And so I'm not at all sure that much of the Christian right has in fact abandoned the ideas of Rushdoony. It's rather they have a different sense of priority and pacing as to how do you get to the biblical order.
That's an interesting take. Maybe they haven't rejected it, as you say. It's just on the down low then. It's like, well, we're not going to emphasize that right now. We'll put that on the back burner. When we are in charge,
yes, for example, Herb Titus, who was a prominent Christian right attorney, he was the founding dean of the law school at Pat Robertson's Regent University. And he would teach the introduction to constitutional law class at the law school. And he taught the Institutes of Biblical Law alongside the standard works of constitutional law. Because, as he put it, if you were going to be a Christian lawyer, you needed to understand these things. So they understand that they're of two worlds, but they have an agenda going forward. I visited the campus a number of times to see what's going on. And so one time there was a young woman coming out of the classroom building there, holding the Institutes of Biblical Law. She and I had a big old conversation about it.
I couldn't help but notice that book you're carrying.
Couldn't help but notice, exactly.
R.J. Rushdoony, ever heard of him?
And if you go to the library at Regent University, as I have, there's a huge collection of Christian Reconstructionist literature and other materials, and not just Rushdoony.
And what's that doing there? And we know, like, for example, Michelle Bachmann, I think she went to ORU, Oral Roberts University Law School. She was also exposed to R.J. Rushdoony. I think that was one of the core textbooks as well at ORU Law School at the time.
ORU eventually closed its law school and gave it to Regent University.
Right. It was folded into.
It was folded in.
Right.
But she studied, it was a small law school faculty at ORU, and she was studying with Christian Reconstructionists like John Eidsmoe and Herb Titus.
Right.
Now, Herb Titus, on the other hand, says that, and I talked to him at a press conference one time about this, because he said that he didn't go along with all of contemporary application of Old Testament biblical law. He didn't go into detail about where he differed from Rushdoony on that, but he could be one of these pacing and priorities guys.
Right. We're not emphasizing that at the moment. When we get in charge, yes, it's so true, isn't it? Well, there must be some connection to Liberty University Law School as well. Is there any traces of Christian Reconstructionism that you've been able to uncover at Liberty University?
Well, yeah, Liberty University sort of went through a process because Jerry Falwell and the others were premillennialists who publicly rejected Rushdoony, although it's also true that Falwell was publishing Rushdoony, in fact, in his Moral Majority report back in the day. So some of the leading thinkers, theologians who taught at Liberty at the time were people who publicly rejected Christian Reconstructionism. However, I think that over time, Reconstructionist, Dominionist ideas have been thoroughly infused into Liberty, just as they have into the world of evangelicalism in general.
Yes.
That's been the plan, right? For this body of ideas to defeat that body of ideas. And I think that some Christian Reconstructionists have said that they basically won the war, and that the rest is just, as Gary North once put it, a cleanup operation.
Oh, right. We're just mopping up now, huh?
Yeah, now that's a bit of exaggerated braggadocio on his part, but he's not entirely wrong. You find very few people who are full blown. The rapture is going to happen, and the good Christians will be brought up into the clouds, and the forces of God and the forces of Satan will battle it out on the earth, and then Jesus will come in the end. You don't hear that stuff much anymore. It's there, but that was the dominant narrative throughout certainly American televangelism, through the 1980s. But it went through a gradual shift.
Which is strange because Rushdoony was a post-millennialist, a very staunch post-millennialist. I've read one of his books where he just rails against premillennialists, calling them essentially heretics and all the rest of it, because they've sold out and all that. And they believe that they had to almost establish Christ's kingdom first, and then Christ would return, after which then you have this millennial kingdom perhaps. So it's a completely different sort of theological end times view.
Well, that's right. A field we call eschatology. So what's your vision of the end times? So there was a large process that went on, series of evangelical dialogues, negotiations, if you will, that centered on the idea of politics. You're probably familiar with the Coalition on Revival.
Yes.
And that was the body, started met many times in the 1980s, because if you were politically concerned premillennialist, your theology said that, well, you shouldn't get mucked up in the things of this world, right? You're risking your eternal soul. Satan's ever present in the world as it is, and you can't expect big change until Jesus comes. So don't do it. Hence, evangelicals, at least since the Scopes trials in the United States, were on the political sidelines. But if you're Tim LaHaye or Pat Robertson, it's like, well, how do you navigate that, right? So the Reconstructionists, post-millennialists, and the pre-mills of Jerry Falwell and Tim LaHaye kind of variety had a series of negotiations in which they had a series of statements they could agree or disagree with. And the key one was, well, exactly when is the second coming going to happen? And to what extent should that govern our politics? And so it came down to well, everybody agreed that good Christians ought to do something. The question is,
can't just ignore it.
Can't just ignore it. There's evil in the world, and we're Americans and citizens, and there's stuff that we can and should do. But what and how much, right? And so what they finally, the breakthrough thing was they decided that there were things that needed to be done and that they could agree to disagree with how much could be accomplished until Jesus returned.
Right.
Once you set aside the debate, right? The debate was a thought stopper, right? Like, well, I'm not going to risk my eternal soul over politics, but you must, engage in politics if you're a good Christian. Again, just like anybody else in public life, you can agree to disagree about how much you can reasonably accomplish, but that opened the door to everything. Without that critical shift, right, the Christian right wouldn't have been possible.
Yes, I've read the Coalitions on Revival. They've got their worldview papers, don't they? There's a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
Jay Grimstead and his organization. I don't know what they're doing nowadays, if anything, but what I found fascinating was when I got to the page where it has all the signatories, all these high-profile people who signed the initial statement.
Yes.
I saw the name of when I went to Bible college in the States, the president of my Bible college signed that document. And he, as far as I know, was no dominionist. He was not a Christian Reconstruction that I'm aware of. He was just sort of a dyed-in-the-wool evangelical. He's dead now. But what hit me was, if he was willing to sign that document, that's exactly what you're saying, isn't it? It was sort of it opened up leveled the playing field a little bit, didn't it, among people on the left, the right, and some of the other places to kind of go ahead politically.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so it's sort of been my experience, over time, and it's sort of a basic organizer's idea, is that you have to get people to take the first baby step. Yeah. And after that, the rest of the steps come easier. So if people have been deeply recalcitrant about getting involved in politics, and they say, well, some involvement is okay, and then they get their feet wet and they begin to see what can and perhaps should be done, that opens up lots of possibilities. And that's been the experience of many, many, many evangelicals, in the course of the past few decades.
I hope you are enjoying this bonus episode with Fred Clarkson of the Political Research Associates. I'm so glad that I finally got a hold of Fred. We have been emailing, as I said at the beginning, probably for 2 years, going back and forth, trying to set up a podcast episode, and we finally got it done. And now we've confirmed that Fred is going to be dropping in on our April Mindshift Zoom call. He's going to be coming in on the 25th of April as our guest, and we're going to be going over a lot of this stuff. And of course, Fred broke the story on Project Blitz, and that's what we're going to get into in the second half of this episode, as well as Christian nationalism and some of the other elements in terms of this discussion of the theological foundations of the Christian right. What's their strategy, and what are we seeing even now today, post-Trump era? It's really, really important to keep a handle on what's going on. They're now regrouping. They're going to come back, hopefully, in their view, stronger than ever once Biden finishes his 4 years or 8 years or however long he ends up staying in office. So they're playing the long game for sure. So it's really helpful to understand what's going on in terms of the Christian right, not just in America, but indeed around the world. So how can you get on this call with Fred on the 25th of April? Well, you can be a supporter of this show on Patreon. That gets you access to our closed Mindshift Podcast Facebook group, and it is there that we have our monthly Zoom calls. We've been doing 2 a month. We've got at least 1 booked for April, like I say, with Fred. We might be adding another one, but we're also doing patrons only call, usually around the first or second weekend of the month. We've had 2 of those now, and those have been absolutely fantastic. Basically, we're building a community, a supportive community of people like myself, most of us who have left religion behind and are seeking to rebuild our lives, find our lost identities, as it were. And this is a great way to connect up with other people who are like-minded, who come out of religion like so many of us do. So you can find the links to that in the show notes. And in fact, speaking of patrons of the show, I want to give a huge thank you to Flo and Jim. Conway and Siegelman are the latest supporters of this show on Patreon. So I'm going to be sending them a nice little gift from North Wales. In fact, I got a message on Twitter the other day. Someone tweeted out they received my gift for for being a supporter of the show. And so that was cool to see that they really enjoyed it. So it's just a small token of my appreciation for helping me cover my expenses on this show. I will say too, what's coming up in the next couple of episodes? Well, of course, this one here is a bonus episode, but the next regularly scheduled episode is with Dr. Terry Daniel. She has a podcast called Ask Dr. Death. And this is a fascinating discussion. We get into the subject of death, dying, grief, trauma, religious trauma, mental health, and religion. And then I've got one coming out later with Andrew Jasko. We're talking about the use of psychedelics to treat religious trauma syndrome and PTSD. And in fact, speaking of Andrew, he was just our guest on our second Mindshift Zoom call in the month of March. And I'm going to be posting that up on my public Mindshift Podcast Facebook page, as well as the earlier one we had the week before with Thomas Hanna. We kind of focused on RTS in the month of March. So those two calls, if you want to drop in, have a look. They're going to be available on the public Mindshift Podcast Facebook page. You can like that page, and that way you'll receive notifications anytime I post up content. And speaking of great content, I'll just mention really quickly before we get back into the chat with Fred Clarkson that I have been continuing my discussions every month with Peter Montgomery of the Right Wing Watch. I post those exclusively straight up to my YouTube channel. This last month, a few weeks ago, we had a really good discussion about the Texas connection. Why are there so many organizations and key individuals on the Christian right that come from the state of Texas, or they're headquartered there? And Peter and I explore that. In fact, someone messaged me and said, would you do some stuff on Vision Forum, where Doug Phillips had that organization, which was also, I believe, based out of Texas. So I think next month we're going to be looking at Vision Forum and what all the whole story was around that. And so look for that coming out next month with Peter Montgomery. If you subscribe to my YouTube channel, again, you won't miss any new content that gets posted there. All right, let's get back into the chat with Fred Clarkson. We're going to get into Christian nationalism, Project Blitz, talk about some of the stuff that's coming up in the Christian right, as guys like Fred are so invaluable because he's been writing about this stuff, researching it literally for decades, and he's one of these people that is really on the vanguard of keeping an eye on the Christian right. So let's get back into the chat with Fred and see what we can learn about the theological foundations of the Christian right. Right. Well, and going back to your analogy about moving the ball down the field, if you're using the American football, as we call it here in Britain, that analogy, you don't have to score a touchdown on every play. You're not going to. If you can get a few yards and move the ball, you're doing something positive. For example, this, I don't know what's happened to it, but there was a recent flap with this Madison Cawthorn, and he was accused of sexual abuse and other things, but he was a student at Patrick Henry College, which I thought, aha, this is an interesting connection, because I was writing a book last year. I'm nearly finished with it on Rushdoony's influence on Christian homeschooling, which then led me to Patrick Henry College, because as I'm seeing it, Patrick Henry is trying to advance that ball down the field. They're about 75 to 80% of their student body is homeschooled kids, students, right, who then are trying to get into political as interns. They're getting into the legal field. So they are infiltrating politics and law and other high profile professions. As specifically, I read their handbook. It's got a dominionist overtones all over it, as I saw it, kind of a Seven Mountains mandate sort of thing.
Well, yeah, Michael Ferris, the founder, was head of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, which is the biggest, network of homeschoolers.
And now he's head of the ADF, which is even bigger.
Well, that's right. And so, he has a long resume in Christian rights stuff. But yeah, it was originally intended to be the college for Christian homeschoolers. They began to do some affirmative action for non-homeschoolers, but in order to survive. But yeah, during the Bush administration, Bush 2, they were a feeder school into internships in Washington. And, the Bush administration entirely cooperated with that.
Sure. Yeah, they love PhD interns, graduates. They're hard workers, very conservative. And of course, we know in the Trump administration as well, I know a lot of them served as interns for congressmen, congresswomen, senators, Supreme Court judges, federal judges. So they've been infiltrating quietly. We don't know where all the interns are. I guess there may be a way to find out, but that's a concern. I think that these people are just sneaking in the back door in a way through Patrick Henry.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And other schools.
Yeah. Liberty as well. Yeah. And other
Liberty,
places.
when I was first started doing this stuff and thinking about these things, there was no Liberty University. There was Jerry Falwell, who had a weekly Sunday,
Old Time Gospel Hour.
Old Time Gospel Hour
That's the one.
Broadcast his Sunday sermon. And he was a pugnacious figure, so he became prominent. But there was no Liberty University. That came later, and it's now the largest Christian university in the world.
That's huge.
So in just a few decades, it became the largest Christian university in the world, which is really, to me, it's one of the a lens through which to view the growth and the power of evangelical Protestantism in the United States. That fact alone tells you what you need to know, and that we're not talking about a bunch of ill-educated rubes, with crazy beliefs. We're talking about well-educated professional class of people bent on influencing culture and taking political power.
Yeah, they're gonna change the world, Christianizing America. I know we haven't talked about this, but to what extent is Christian nationalism playing into all of this? Because surely a huge motivating factor in the drive behind a lot of these people doing this stuff, Christianizing America, is their belief in Christian nationalism. They want to take America back for God and all that kind of language. 2 Chronicles 7:14 and all the rest of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Christian nationalism thing, it wasn't even on the public radar screen, until Whitehead and Perry, published their op-ed in the Washington Post in the lead up to their publishing their book based on, survey data.
Yeah.
And what had happened there was that as you'll know, is that they realized that belief in America as a Christian nation was the greatest predictor of likelihood of voting for Donald Trump. Now, this was a breakthrough thing because nobody ever thought about it that way before. Pollsters, religious and non-religious, just didn't think in those terms. They just didn't. So, and so that's been helpful for those of us who write and talk about these things, because suddenly it's okay to think about it and there's a frame of reference. Problem with it is that it's now become an epithet. It's like an all-purpose catchphrase that it's tagged everything. People have argued with me, well, you can't use the term Christian right anymore. You have to use Christian nationalism. I said, no, you don't. What is Christian nationalism exactly?
Right.
And so people have a wide variety of interpretations of what it even is. And so it's one of those terms you really have to break down to even find it useful.
So how do you define it? Then what is Christian nationalism?
I define it, much of the way that the poll would have found it, right? And that is the idea: if you believe, say, that God and the founding fathers intended the United States to be a Christian nation, that's a certain anchor, a mythological anchor in your politics, right, and your views. But it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with, like, if you have a biblical worldview and therefore what should government look like, well, you don't have any idea unless you've read Rushdoony, or somebody who's written about Rushdoony, because that become the standard. So it's one thing to say, well, I believe in a biblical worldview. Well, what's that? Exactly.
You got to unpack that.
You got to unpack it. And so these become great, big, fuzzy terms that lose all nuance and all clarity and good scholarship and good reporting. And so, that Christian nationalist myth has been there all along. But what I argue with my friends about this, and that's say, Christian nationalism, it's always been there. There were, people may or may not have used the term back at the founding, but they meant something kind of like that. And it's certainly the idea of Christian nationalism and the idea of a Christian nation goes back to at least Dabney. Catherine Stewart's written about that in her book. But, what I tell people is, this idea has been out there. It's kind of a warm and fuzzy thing if you're a conservative Christian, but there was no there. It didn't mean anything. It didn't animate anything. It was sort of a justificational anchor for some of what they did, but it justified everything, right? But didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything until Rushdoony came along and created dominionism, which gave an actual political, governmental architecture to what a Christian nation might be. There is no Christian nationalism without dominionism, and that's the piece most people miss.
That is a huge connection, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you can, yeah, I think too, the problem is, you go back to the Puritans, Winthrop, and some other people. I mean, I think that a lot of them did truly believe that the colonies did have some sort of covenant with God. They did
Sure.
see themselves as the new Israel coming to the promised land. They saw themselves as sort of the embodiment of Old Testament Israel in many, many ways. So
Sure.
there's enough to it. So a guy like David Barton comes along
Right.
and says,
That's, I love
look
your
at all
drift
these,
there.
yeah,
That's
look
right.
at all these quotes.
Well, all those quotes that have nothing to do with the formation of the United States.
Exactly. But they truly believed it. Somehow he's projected that onto all of America, saying all of the founding fathers were all staunch, basically evangelicals. They believe they have a covenant with God, and therefore we do. We just do. And we've gone astray from it. We need to get back to it. And there's your Christian nationalist sort of narrative, isn't it?
Well, that's right. It's a kind of revisionist history to justify, your contemporary religious and political views in terms of your claims about the intentions of God and the founding fathers. The historian Frank Lambert has written about this, and he calls it a usable history, right? Usable history.
Very convenient facts. Alternative facts.
Alternative facts. That's right. Barton was doing alternative facts before we even knew what they were.
Hey, there you go.
But that's critically important to understand. One of the ways that I try to unpack or expose this stuff is say, look, these guys are treating the Pilgrims of the Puritans and the founding fathers 150 years later as if they all believed exactly the same thing.
Right. It wasn't a monolithic belief that applied to everybody.
Well, they try to act like Barton, people like that will act like they did.
Yes.
Right. And the cherry pick quotes make it sound like, oh, yeah, well, everybody was religious in exactly the same way. Well, they weren't. They all were in tremendous theological and political disagreement with another, because that's what human beings are like.
I think, too, I read Kurt Anderson's Fantasyland, and he does a good job of talking about the founders. And it was basically, he says America was founded on a fantasy of gold and treasure that you could just pick up off the beaches and all that. But in addition to that, it was this widespread belief that, yes, you could practice your own religious beliefs without fear of persecution from the state like they experienced here in Europe. So there was a plethora of nutcase religions that came along, Mormonism and all these other religions, Christian Science, and on and on and on and on. What about those? There was some of the very earliest people that came over here to America for religious freedom and established a religion. It wasn't a Christian religion necessarily.
Well, yeah, it's in the United States and its predecessor colonies were always religiously diverse. People of Jefferson's era, they personally knew Muslims, and Hindus, and
right.
and Buddhists. I mean, Washington and the Potomac, were a center of trade, and there were people coming in from all over the world, and so yeah. They were educated people who knew about these things, and there were tremendous religious diversity even in the colonies in that era. So, to think of something as monolithically even conservative evangelical Christian is silly on its face.
Right. Well, now we've talked about this kind of stealth approach, maybe like the Patrick Henry College and interns in the Trump administration, or even as far back as the Bush administration. What about some of the more overt things? Because I know you've written and talked about Project Blitz. For example, that's one thing. That's a straight up power play, isn't it? Or a few years ago, I don't know what's happened to some of these states, but about, 2 or 3 years ago, we saw all of a sudden in, 8 or 9 states, these super restrictive abortion laws that they tried to get passed. And a lot of them failed, but they're on the books now, aren't they? So this seems like some straight up power plays by people on the Christian right. What can you tell us about things like Project Blitz?
Project Blitz is really interesting. I broke the original story on it, and it's the key piece in it is this 140-page manual of model legislation in a number of different categories. What was most interesting to me, other than its clear dominionist intent, was that what they'd wanted to do was to take the learned experience from having their successes and their failures from around the country, and saying and introducing legislation that would allow you to post "In God We Trust" in public buildings. That's been a big one for Project Blitz, but it's been a big one for the Christian right for a long time. And so how you go about it may depend on the outcome. So they had all of this background and talking points about how to approach it, how to answer critics, what the most common objections would be, and how you counter them. I'd never seen anything like it. And the organization sponsoring it, actually posted the manual on their own website.
Yes, I've read it.
I've never seen anybody blunder like that before.
Yeah, they made a huge mistake. It was the Congressional Prayer Caucus? Wasn't that who it was? Or one of the organizations?
Yeah, it's a spin-off of the Congressional Prayer Caucus called the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation,
right?
Which is a C3 spin-off of the Congressional Prayer Caucus, founded by the same guy, former Congressman Randy Forbes of Virginia. So, yeah, and their legislative program is called Project Blitz. An unfortunate choice of names, but
especially if you're from London, that's not a good memory for them.
Well, that's right. That's right. Or, in France and Belgium. But
yes.
But in any case, there's enormous manual model bills, many of which were taken up by a national network of state legislators they created, many of them David Barton's network, because he was one of the people behind this. And they took the model bills and adapted them to their state's circumstances and introduced them in a stealth fashion. And a lot of them passed, a lot of them failed, but nevertheless, the intention there was to drive the debate. Some were relatively easy, low-hanging fruit, not as controversial as some others. It's one thing to, declare Religious Freedom Day, let's say. It's like, well, you can have a resolution to declare whatever. Politicians do that all the time.
Right. Pretty innocuous.
And so they wanted
not going to offend anybody.
That's right. And so, but they would the idea was to move towards the more seriously theocratic, more controversial legislation as they built up political momentum over time.
I read through the book and I was the same, what you're describing, isn't it? It's like, they said, look, just start off, take that low hanging fruit, things like putting in God we trust on license plates or the side of a police car or a fire engine or something like that, or a public building. And we know a lot of them are going to get shot down. And that's kind of the point, isn't it? It's sort of like whack-a-mole. We'll just keep we'll flood this place with so much legislation that eventually they'll blitz it, literally. Some of this has got to get through. It's like the Normandy landings, isn't it? If we just overwhelm the defenses, eventually enough of us are going to get through to take the beachhead, So it struck me. And then they got into stuff like, like you're saying, Bible reading in schools and Bible literacy programs and things like that. And it's like, okay, this has gone from a state license plate to now forcing people to read the Bible as literature, in air quotes, in a public school.
Well, yeah. I mean, I read the Bible as literature, in college, but there's sort of age and education level appropriateness to that kind of stuff. But that's the thing. There's a point at which, what is education and what's indoctrination? And they're clearly using the idea of education in a sense as a form of indoctrination. So there's a lot of clever stuff like that. But I'd be remiss if I didn't add that, this is a legislative program, or a legislative program, but it wouldn't be possible if they didn't also have a political program, to make it real, right? And so the idea of the Christian right is to elect people to office, right? State legislators and governors and those sorts of state level offices are critical to moving this agenda. State legislation, you have to have the votes.
Sure.
So
you gotta have the numbers.
So when Project Blitz started, right, was 2015, beginning to look at the 2016 legislative session. Since now going back to the end of the Bush administration, the Republican Party and the Christian right had a plan, and that was to elect as many people to the state legislature as they could, and to flip control of legislative chambers, of which there are 99 in the United States, from Democratic to Republican, because the Democrats sort of had a hegemonic control of state legislatures at the time. The first goal was to affect every 10 years there's a census, right? Of everybody in the United States, and you reapportion legislative districts, Congress and state legislatures, according to where the people are. So it's roughly proportionate, and therefore roughly one person, one vote kind of representation. So the idea was to be able to gerrymander the legislative districts that are controlled by the states so that they could maximize their political control. And the result of all of that, beginning in 2010, was in the election of 2010, they won hundreds and hundreds of seats. and flipped many state legislative chambers. And they continued that pattern until the Democrats finally put the brakes on it in 2018. And so Project Blitz is cooked up in the middle of this period when the Republicans of the Christian Right are taking, during the Obama administration, the Democrats lost 1,000 state legislative seats across the country, which was just unprecedented in American political history.
Huge turnaround.
Huge turnaround.
Yeah.
And so the Christian Right understood that this was a moment of opportunity, right? And hence the idea of the Blitz. They had to move quickly and forcefully to ram their agenda while they still had the power to do so.
Yeah, strike while the iron's hot.
Yep.
But now we've just finished 4 years of the Trump administration. We haven't really talked about Trump, and I know we're running out of time here, but we've had 4 years of Trump, the huge evangelical vote base for him, 81% white evangelical votes. They saw him as their Messiah. They saw him, as I understand it, as the means of attaining dominion. Now they didn't get it. Now they're all devastated and angry that he got voted out of office. Of course, he didn't lose, Fred. He lost because of voter fraud.
I've heard that. I've heard that.
Yes, you may have heard that somewhere, but maybe a Rudy Giuliani or a Trump, I don't know, or whatever. But they've now gotten really angry. However, toward the end, they got a couple of Supreme Court justices. Amy Coney Barrett was shoved through with seconds to spare. And it seems like the cynical ploy there was, look, we'll stack the Supreme Court as well as many other federal benches. Trump appointed hundreds of judges, didn't he? Then we'll eventually overturn Roe versus Wade. Isn't that kind of one of the major aims of the Christian Right? They see abortion as the biggest corporate sin of America.
Well, they do. And they won, and they will.
So you think Roe versus Wade will be overturned then?
It'll be overturned or significantly gutted and rendered meaningless.
Right.
Even the Supreme Court, is politically wily. They don't want to get too far ahead of the public, which is overwhelmingly pro-choice. So they can gut it without overturning it and having the least political backlash. That's a possibility. But the idea that Roe and what it meant as we've historically understood it, is over. Will be within the next couple of years.
There will be, yeah. So the ball is advancing down the field.
Well, that's right. And there'll be increasing opportunities, because the court is stacked this way too, for religious exemptions to standard civil rights laws, particularly those protecting LGBTQ people, and but also labor laws around pensions and all kinds of things, because there are quite a few religious exemptions written right into the laws as they were written. And the Christian Right attorneys, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, have gone and found where all those places are and are running with it, and they have a sympathetic federal judiciary to make it so.
So even though Trump has left office, that legacy, I mean, we've said that before, many people have said, haven't they? The biggest legacy that Trump will have left behind is all these judges on the bench. And the most obvious example is the Supreme Court justices that he shoved through, even though now there's this breaking story about the Kavanaugh investigation. They're saying, the FBI it was a fake investigation. There's probably a lot of pressure from William Barr's DOJ at the time and said, we're going to shut this thing down because we need to get him through. So is anything going to come of that? They're saying, well, we should impeach Kavanaugh. I don't know if anything's going to happen there, but that was a sham investigation, it seems like.
Yeah, it was. It was kind of known at the time, but nobody had the power to do anything about it.
That's it.
And now there are people who are interested who do have the power to do something about it. Now, it was a sham investigation, and one of the things that should have been looked at, and now I think will be looked at, is Kavanaugh was massively in debt at the time of nomination, and some mysterious benefactor mysteriously paid off all of his debt.
Disappeared.
Where'd that money come from? Who was that? And what does Kavanaugh then owe somebody?
Exactly. It's such an interesting story. I hope they investigate that angle as well as the sham investigation, whether or not it goes anywhere. I suppose it's like all the Trump lawsuits that he's facing now that he's no longer president. Will anything come of it? He's got lawsuits galore and investigations galore. Will anybody finally bring him down? He's never had to account for anything his entire life. He's gotten away with everything. Well,
yeah, I think the bills come due for him and his family and all of their associates. The idea that Donald Trump will be a major power in the Republican Party or that his children will ever be elected to office is, farcical. It isn't going to happen. They're going to be too busy, being prosecuted, having court dates, dealing with lawyers, being in and out of prison, and engaging in the most spectacular tabloid, mutual betrayal soap opera that the country's ever seen.
Yeah. There's a lot of intrigue going on. They're trying to flip certain people like Weisselberg and his daughter and other people that were, they know where all the skeletons are in all the closets in the Trump organization, don't they? Michael Cohen's obviously singing like a canary, so they've got a lot of stuff, and having his tax returns, right. So it just goes deeper and deeper, doesn't it?
It's just a matter of time, and Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend is being, in negotiations on her situation as well. So a lot of the most corrupt and criminal things that have gone on in recent decades, there's going to be some accountability soon.
Well, listen, I know that our time is drawing to a close. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. How can people find you? What's the best way to reach you in terms of social media?
Well, I'm pretty visible on Twitter at Fred Clarkson.
Pretty straightforward?
Pretty straightforward.
And obviously, you do a search on your name, you'll find articles. You've got some books out there. I was going to say, now I know we as long as we've talked for an hour, though, we barely touched the tip of the iceberg. I would love to talk to you again. If you're wanting to do that, I would love to have you back on, and we could take another deep dive into some more of the Christian right, some of the areas that maybe we didn't get a chance to cover. So if you're up for that, I'd love to chat again.
Sure, we can do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Fred. I will speak to you again then.
All right, very good.